The 12th of March 1945, outside Kassel, Germany. A pale winter sun struggled through a thin sheet of cloud, its light diffused into a cold silver glow that washed across the fractured countryside. Smoke drifted slowly above half-frozen fields, curling from the skeletons of barns and shattered tree lines where artillery had passed only hours before. The wind pressed against the crumpled remains of a village, carrying the faint metallic ring of dislocated roofing sheets swaying in the breeze. Along a muddy clearing on the outskirts of the town, US ground forces advanced in deliberate, cautious steps, their armored columns moving with engines rumbling low beneath the layered hush of an uneasy morning. Far above them, in a clearer band of sky, the 352nd Fighter Group cut a path through the thin cloud deck. Their P-51 Mustangs, bare metal and matte olive panels streaked with fine exhaust lines, held tight formation, their Merlin engines humming in a synchronized, deep-throated note that vibrated through each pilot's harness. The mission had been routine at briefing, protective cover for the advancing infantry and armor columns driving northeast toward an industrial sector still held by German forces. The Luftwaffe, though weakened, remained unpredictable. Intermittent pockets of fighters operated from makeshift airfields and forest strips, launching sudden raids that could exploit any gap in Allied air cover. Major Curtis Hargrove, leading the flight, flew slightly ahead and above the others, boots firm on the rudder pedals, eyes moving steadily across the horizon. His Mustang shuddered faintly when crossing the uneven edges of cloud pockets, wings tipping gently as he compensated. The radio carried only occasional bursts of static, and the ground controllers far behind offered no signs of enemy formations. But there was a tension in the air, an almost physical tightness that experienced pilots felt long before they saw silhouettes or contrails. The region below, cut with river bends and dark forest belts, had been the site of sudden Luftwaffe counter-sorties in the past week. On the German side of the front, near a camouflaged airstrip carved into the woods east of Kassel, the remnants of a Luftwaffe fighter squadron prepared for another attempt to disrupt the American advance. Their aircraft, mostly Bf-109GS and a handful of FW-190As, were worn from months of attrition. Crews worked in near silence, their hands stiff from the cold, tightening cowling latches and checking ammunition drums. Generators rattled as mechanics tried to coax life into engines that coughed dark smoke on startup. Fuel was rationed carefully, each sortie measured by necessity rather than strategy. Yet the order was clear: intercept the American columns and buy time for retreating units. The German officers overseeing the operation watched the preparations with a sober, almost resigned focus. Reports had been grim, Mustangs sweeping the airspace with increasing dominance, their speed and climb rates overwhelming. But the squadron was expected to fly. A few pilots exchanged brief nods beneath leather flight helmets as they climbed into their cockpits. There was no ceremony, no hardened bravado, only a quiet, practiced acceptance. Back at altitude, the Mustang engines droned on. The cloud deck began to thin, revealing the terrain below in broad patches. Hargrove looked down at flickers of movement, columns threading along the roads, armored hulls catching the light. He toggled his radio. Keep spread. Eyes open. Luftwaffe might try again in this sector. A soft chorus of acknowledgements crackled back. The flight adjusted accordingly, wings glinting as they repositioned. When the first distant glimmer appeared on the northeast horizon, small, intermittent flashes reflecting sunlight off aluminum, the pilots didn't react immediately. It could have been debris or a trick of the upper haze. But within seconds, the faint dots multiplied, organizing into a rough formation. Hargrove felt the subtle shift in his breathing. In the pit of his stomach, he recognized the moment before recognition met confirmation. He eased his throttle hand and narrowed his eyes. The dots weren't fading. They were growing. And they were coming fast. The wind hissed softly along the Mustang canopy as the entire flight adjusted their course, sliding into a looser formation with the fluid instinct only veteran pilots possessed. Beneath the clouds, the ground advance continued unaware, boots pressing into mud, tank tracks grinding forward in steady lines. The sky was about to change. And the men below would never see the first moment it began. The formations continued to close, their lines sharpening as they cut through the last veil of cloud. Hargrove recognized the silhouettes first: narrow noses, squared wingtips, the distinctive flicker of propellers hitting sunlight. Bf-109s, maybe a dozen, with several heavier-winged FW-190s behind them in a layered escort pattern. The Luftwaffe squadron was attempting to gain altitude advantage, approaching from above and ahead, hoping to dive through the Mustangs and sprint toward the ground forces below. Hargrove steadied his breath. The American formation remained outwardly calm, each pilot adjusting position with minimal radio chatter. The quiet tension settled like a second skin, familiar, cold, almost ritualistic. He keyed his MIC once. Bandits 12 high. Estimate 15 plus. Stay disciplined. The Mustangs tightened incrementally, slipping into a spread that maximized maneuver room without sacrificing visual coverage. Their engines deepened in tone as throttle levers crept forward. Air pressure thickened around the canopy frames, and the slipstream noise intensified into a steady roar. The world below shrank, the ground reduced to a dull, shifting tapestry of forest, road, and smoke. The German formation descended another few hundred meters, their lead fighters adjusting into a shallow attack slope. Inside their cockpits, the Luftwaffe pilots scanned through gun sights, trying to locate gaps in the American formation. They had trained for this: dives, slashing attacks, rapid egress, but the Mustangs were no longer the relatively new threat they had once been. By early 1945, they had become the defining force of Allied air power. Fast, agile, long-ranged, and flown by pilots hardened by years of escort and sweep missions. In the American formation, Staff Sergeant Miller on Hargrove's right flank tightened his grip around the control stick, feeling the slight tremor in the Mustang's frame as the engine pushed toward military power. He kept his eyes locked on the descending Germans. They were disciplined, but their formation had small inconsistencies, wings drifting slightly, one pilot lagging a fraction behind his line. Fatigue. Mechanical limits. Stress. All visible from a distance if one knew how to read the subtle cues. Hargrove's altitude advantage had evaporated. The Luftwaffe pilots had executed a clean approach and were pressing it. But the Mustangs carried speed, and their climb rates at this altitude remained formidable. He pushed his throttle to the gate. The Merlin engine responded instantly, the nose lifting, the cockpit shuddering with controlled vibration. Below, American infantry continued moving northeast, oblivious to the silent duel of positioning occurring thousands of feet above them. The wind carried distant artillery rumbles, but nothing suggested the incoming aerial clash forming over their heads. Back in the sky, the first German wing rolled into a slightly steeper dive. They had committed. The tension inside every cockpit crystallized. A second later, Hargrove leveled his Mustang and made the decision. The Americans would not dive away to protect the ground forces. They would instead cut upward through the German attack slope, disrupting the strike before it materialized. It was a risky call. Meeting a diving enemy head-on required timing, precision, and absolute nerve. But it could break the Luftwaffe formation before it ever reached attack speed. He transmitted a calm, clipped command. Climb. Break their run. Now. The Mustangs moved as one, throttle surging, wings flexing under the rising load factor. The German formation wavered slightly at the unexpected maneuver. The Luftwaffe expected evasive behavior or a defensive role. Instead, the Mustangs accelerated directly into their approach vector. The sky compressed into converging lines of metal. Propellers blurred. Distances closed. The air tasted of oil, pressure, and approaching violence. No one looked at the ground. Every eye was locked on the shapes ahead, moving faster with each breath. The first pass came with the violence of compressed speed meeting raw geometry. The German leaders fired early, streaks of tracers cutting downward in narrow arcs. The Mustangs held formation until the last possible moment before splitting into synchronized brake turns, wings knifing through the air, engines screaming under sudden strain. The Luftwaffe's attack slope fractured instantly. Their dive no longer struck a unified path. Instead, each pilot adjusted to avoid collision as the Americans disrupted their vector. Hargrove rolled sharply left, pulling into a climbing spiral that forced the nearest Bf-109 to overshoot. The German aircraft flashed past, its canopy briefly catching the light. Hargrove reversed the turn, dropped his nose, and aligned his gun sight. The Mustang shook as he fired, a short, disciplined burst. The tracers tore into the enemy fighter's wing root. Smoke erupted, followed by a thin flame that broke into a sudden spill of debris. The 109 arced downward, trailing a dark ribbon. All around him, the sky erupted into layered circles of twisting motion, Mustangs climbing, rolling, diving, cutting through the German formation with predatory speed. Their power-to-weight ratio and control harmony allowed high-speed reversals the Luftwaffe pilots struggled to match. The German squadron had numbers, but their aircraft lacked the altitude and energy advantage they needed to sustain the fight. Staff Sergeant Miller caught an FW-190 crossing below his nose, the enemy pilot attempting a tight brake turn to re-enter the fight. Miller flipped his Mustang into a descending arc, the G-force sinking heavily into his chest. The gun sights aligned for only a moment. He fired. The 190 jolted, a section of its right wing fracturing under the impact. The fighter spun violently, the pilot bailing out seconds before it struck the forest below. Another Mustang pair swept through the center, rolling between two enemy fighters locked in a defensive turn. Their synchronized maneuver sliced the German arc apart, forcing one pilot to brake right, the other left. The Americans pursued both. The engagement compressed into a destructive rhythm. German pilots attempted climbing spirals to regain altitude, but the Mustangs cut through them with superior climb and acceleration. FW-190s tried slashing dives, but the Americans counterdived with greater speed retention, undercutting their maneuver space. Bf-109s attempted vertical loops, but weakened engines and insufficient airspeed stalled their arcs, leaving them vulnerable. Within minutes, the Luftwaffe squadron lost cohesion entirely. Individual pilots maneuvered on instinct, no longer following orchestrated tactics. The German ground controllers, watching helpless contrails from the forest clearing, could only listen to fragmented radio reports, calls for assistance, warnings of Mustangs above and below, clipped voices disappearing into static. The Mustangs held the initiative relentlessly. Their formations dissolved into fluid hunter pairs, each pilot coordinating visually rather than relying on radio communication. The sky became a shifting mosaic of aircraft weaving through one another, but the Americans consistently seized the upper position. Lieutenant Harris executed a high-speed roll and dove onto a 109 that had broken away from the main fight. The German pilot tried to take refuge in cloud cover, but Harris anticipated the line of escape. He fired into the edge of the cloud, and the fighter burst from the other side, trailing smoke. Seconds later it disappeared into the hills below. 9 minutes after the first shots, the fight was effectively over. Scattered debris drifted downward. Parachutes dotted the air like pale, falling leaves. Only a handful of German aircraft remained airborne, each fleeing northeast at full throttle. The Mustangs held position rather than pursue deep into enemy territory. Their engines dropped to a steady hum as the sky returned to cold stillness. The roar faded. Only the wind remained. The Mustangs regrouped at altitude, wings reforming in steady lines as the last pieces of debris disappeared into the distant landscape. The radio crackled with brief status confirmations. No triumph, no theatrics, only the measured tone of pilots ensuring their flight remained intact. One American aircraft limped with a damaged wing panel but held stable enough for return. The rest reported clean. Below them, the front moved on, unaware of the scale of the engagement that had just occurred overhead. Infantry units continued their push eastward. Tank engines rumbled across softened roads. None saw the brief, violent arc that had altered the airspace entirely. Hargrove took a final glance toward the northeast, where the last surviving German fighters had vanished. He keyed his MIC. "Form up. We're heading back." The Mustangs banked gently, their wings catching the dull afternoon light as they turned west. The terrain rolled beneath them, forests, broken towns, the pale lines of roads leading toward the Allied main body. The wind had eased. The clouds thickened again, casting long shadows over the ground. Back at the German forward airstrip, officers gathered near a field map spread across a wooden table inside a half-collapsed shelter. The surviving pilots, those few who had managed to land or bail out within friendly lines, provided fragmented accounts. Most described the same thing. The Americans had climbed unexpectedly into their attack run, seized the initiative within seconds, and shattered the formation before it could strike the ground forces. The German commanders listened in grave silence. They had expected losses. They had not expected a near-total collapse in less than 10 minutes. Reports filtered upward through the chain of command. Higher headquarters noted the engagement as yet another example of diminishing Luftwaffe capability against increasingly dominant Allied fighters. The encounter reinforced what many officers already knew. The strategic air balance had fully tipped, and tactical air superiority now belonged entirely to the Mustangs and their pilots. When the Americans landed back at their airfield, their Mustangs rolled to a stop in neat rows. Ground crews swarmed them, inspecting bullet holes, measuring ammunition expenditure, wiping exhaust streaks with practice motions. The pilots climbed down quietly, their faces marked by fatigue rather than excitement. There were no celebrations. Just the muted acceptance of another mission completed. That evening, intelligence officers compiled the encounter into operational records. The analysis remained straightforward. The Luftwaffe squadron had been effectively destroyed. German headquarters had underestimated the Mustang's ability to maneuver aggressively at altitude and respond instantly to a descending attack slope. The engagement underscored the tactical maturity of American fighter doctrine, flexible formations, independent maneuver pairs, and a willingness to seize initiative even at the expense of traditional defensive posture. In the days that followed, the front moved deeper into central Germany. The Luftwaffe launched fewer sorties, each one thinner and more desperate than the last. The engagement near Kassel became one of several small but decisive moments demonstrating the erosion of German air power. In the final archival notes summarizing the event, a single sentence captured its significance. German command was stunned by the speed at which the Mustang units broke and annihilated the intercepting squadron. In the quiet after the analysis, long after the engines had cooled and the field lights dimmed, the significance of the encounter settled into historical memory, one more step in the closing sequence of a conflict defined by the skies. And the wind carried on, whispering through the hangars, across the fields, and through the empty air where the battle had briefly raged, then vanished into silence.